Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up 9 bipartisan measures. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous material on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intend to consider today's measures en bloc. The measures are H.R. 2615, the United States Northern Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act, Omar, H.Res, Wagner, Engel, and McCall amendments to that. H.R. 2744, the USAID Branding Modernization Act. H.R. 598, Georgia Support Act. H.R. 2140, the Preventing Child Marriage Act with a Wagner Amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.R. 2023, the Protect European Energy Security Act with an Engel Amendment. H.R. 2046, the Energy Diplomacy Act with a McCall Amendment. House Resolution 129, condemning the government of Saudi Arabia's continued detention and alleged abuse of women's rights activists with an Engel Amendment in the nature of a substitute. House Resolution 372, expressing concern for the United States-Turkey alliance, and the Engel Amendment in the nature of a substitute to House Resolution 345, recognizing widening threats to freedoms of the press and expression around the world, reaffirming the centrality of a free and independent press to the health of democracy, and reaffirming freedom of the press as a priority of the United States. At this time, I recognize myself to speak on today's business. We have 9 good bipartisan bills before us today, and I'm pleased to support every one of them. I want to first mention the United States Northern Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act, which I introduced along with Ranking Member McCall to address the root causes of migration from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Mr. McCall and I visited El Salvador in March, just as the Trump administration announced that it was cutting off assistance to the Northern Triangle countries. We saw firsthand the positive impact that U.S. foreign assistance is having in creating much-needed opportunities and stemming violence in those countries. We need to continue to invest in a safer and more prosperous Central America to create more opportunities for the people living there. This bill does just that by authorizing $577 million in assistance for Central America. This is a good bill, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting it. Providing foreign assistance helps people who are both in need and furthers our foreign policy objectives. In El Salvador, when Mr. McCall and I visited programs that teach young adults software engineering, it gave me such pride to see the USAID logo, which was visible to all. So I'm pleased to support the USAID Branding Modernization Act, a bill I'm proud to co-sponsor with Mr. McCall. This legislation affirms the obligation to brand foreign assistance as appropriate and requires a comprehensive review to ensure that USAID-funded projects are appropriately branded in the field. Human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are core American values and should underpin everything we do overseas. So I'm glad that we are considering a number of bills today that promote human rights and freedom of expression. First, Ms. Wagner's Preventing Child Marriage Act, which recognizes the problem of child marriage, particularly among vulnerable refugee populations. Every year, over 10 million girls marry before the age of 18. Early marriage denies children, especially girls, their right to make vital decisions about their well-being, including their health, family, and career. Child brides are less likely to finish their education, and they're at higher risk for abuse, contracting HIV, and dying from pregnancy. This bill tackles this issue by encouraging the U.S. to use its influence to help ensure that displaced populations have the protections and tools to avoid illegal child marriage, work that organizations like UNFPA are doing around the world. It's a good bill to empower young women and girls, and I'm proud to support it. Next, we have House Resolution 129, authored by Representatives Frankel and Wagner, which focuses on the unjust imprisonment of women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia. We must continue to call on the Saudi government to release these women immediately. I strongly support this resolution, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I'll turn now to House Resolution 345, which recognizes that freedom of the press is under threat around the world. Thank you to Mr. Chabot and Mr. Schiff for their work on this legislation. There are far too many violent, shocking examples of journalists being imprisoned, tortured, and murdered around the world. A free press is critical to any democracy. It shines a light on corruption and impunity. This resolution condemns threats to independent media and calls on governments to continue to address journalists' safety. It has my strong support. America's alliances and partnerships are another key pillar of our foreign policy. So I'm glad that a number of the measures in our markup today deal with our allies and diplomacy. The Georgia Support Act, authored by Mr. Connolly and Mr. Kinzinger, called for continued U.S. support for Georgia, an important U.S. partner. Georgia was invaded by Russia in 2008, and the Kremlin continues to attack Georgia through subversive disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks. H.R. 598 provides Georgia with assistance to combat this threat and support its democratic institutions. It's a good bill to advance the U.S.-Georgia relationship, and I'm glad we're moving it forward today. The Protect European Energy Security Act also combats Russia's increasingly malign encroachment on our European partners. The Nord Stream 2 and the Turk Stream gas pipelines from Russia to Germany and Turkey would increase European dependence on Russian energy sources. H.R. 2023 restates our opposition to these projects and requires the administration to report on how they impact European security and susceptibility to Russian influence. Next, we have the House Resolution number 372, a measure I introduced with Mr. McCall on the U.S.-Turkey relationship. President Erdogan has tightened his grip on power and rolled back democracy in Turkey. At the same time, he's cozied up to Putin and purchased the Russian S-400 air and missile defense system. Today's resolution condemns Erdogan for his authoritarian behavior and calls on Turkey to cancel delivery of the Russian weapons system. Of course, they want us to sell them our system, but we cannot do that if they don't cancel delivery of the Russian weapons system. They can't have it both ways. You can't have a NATO country buying Russian equipment. Finally, we have Mr. Wright's Energy Diplomacy Act. For the United States to maintain a leading role on the global stage, the State Department must be positioned to protect and promote favorable energy policies abroad. This bill creates and authorizes the creation of a new Assistant Secretary position to lead this charge. So in conclusion, I'm pleased to support all of these bills, and I'd like to thank our members for their hard work, and I'll now recognize our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, our committee will mark up 6 important bills and 3 resolutions. I'd like to highlight just a few. Northern Triangle. As you mentioned, our trip to the Northern Triangle, the United States Northern Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act, which I'm the lead Republican on, increases congressional oversight of foreign assistance to the Northern Triangle and prioritizes security and the role of the private sector in supporting economic development efforts. We saw the good work of the international law enforcement community down there, the FBI, the DEA, working to combat MS-13, and we also saw many faith-based NGOs as well. It addresses, in my judgment, the root cause drivers of illegal migration from Central America and takes steps to help stop the flow at our borders. It also builds on existing efforts to increase coordination with Mexico in our efforts to curb illegal migration and combats corruption. I understand and share the President's frustration with the continued stream of migrants to our southern border, especially in my home state of Texas. And we believe we must use all tools at our disposal, including foreign assistance, to best address this growing crisis. Central American countries can and must do more to address their migration flows, and that's why this bill will require them to clearly show results with new benchmarks so progress can be tracked and programs modified or eliminated if warranted. On the branding bill, I'm pleased we're considering the USAID Branding Modernization Act. When I talked to Mark Green, he said shockingly that we do not put our United States flag on USAID. I think the branding of our foreign assistance is important, in winning the hearts and minds of people that we are helping, while also pushing back against the influence of China and others as they operate overseas. The USAID Administrator, Mark Green, currently has limited authority to brand humanitarian aid. I believe it's important that the USAID be able to use its insignia, the American flag, and other U.S. agency branding as appropriate in each situation so that the recipients of our aid know that it is coming from the American people. This bill will expand the toolbox of branding capabilities that can be utilized by USAID and authorizes the administrator to use such branding in food for peace programs. On child marriage, I want to thank our vice-ranking member, Ms. Wagner, for her bill, the Preventing Child Marriage and Displaced Populations Act, which will require the United Nations to develop a strategy to address the inhumane practice of child marriage in U.S.-administered refugee settlements. I fully support this important legislation. Also, on energy diplomacy, I'd like to thank Mr. Congressman Wright from my home state of Texas, who introduced the Energy Diplomacy Act. This bill ensures the State Department has the leadership and discretion needed to fulfill its statutory responsibilities related to international energy diplomacy. Specifically, the bill replaces the Coordinator for International Energy Affairs with an Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, an elevation requested by the Trump administration in August of 2017. The Assistant Secretary will be responsible for developing and implementing policies to advance U.S. energy interest abroad by managing our relations in petroleum, natural gas, biofuels, renewable energy, nuclear, and other energy resources. Further, it requires state to use diplomacy to support the development of U.S. energy resources to bolster our energy security, grow our economy, and support our allies. When it comes to Turkey, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you working with me on this resolution. I'm the lead Republican on it. That expresses our concern for the U.S.-Turkey partnership and NATO alliance. This resolution states that the House fully supports the U.S. offer to sell Turkey our Patriot system and condemns Turkey's decision to acquire the Russian S-400 air and missile defense system. The time has come to put Turkey on notice that if they acquire the S-400 system, Congress will no longer support Turkey's participation in the F-35 program. We want to see Turkey have a course correction and make the better choice. And as you stated, Mr. Chairman, as a NATO ally who was brought into the NATO alliance that was built upon the premise of aligning against the Soviet Union, it seems incomprehensible to me that Turkey, a NATO ally, would buy a Russian S-400 system. This is not acceptable to this committee or to the administration, and I want to thank you, sir, for introducing this resolution. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. I agree with your sentiments about Turkey wholeheartedly. Thank you for making them. Any other member seeking recognition? I think was Mr. H.Res?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, on my amendment.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall, for their partisan cooperation to make this markup possible. I want to speak briefly about an amendment I have introduced to the United States Northern Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act. First, let me just say that I am a strong supporter of continuing U.S. assistance to the Northern Triangle, and that is why I am an original co-sponsor of the underlying bill introduced by the Chairman and Ranking Member. I have seen firsthand in my trips to the region that our programs have been effective in reducing violence and poverty in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. I have many constituents with close ties to the Northern Triangle who remind me about the difficulties they face before coming here and the challenges the rest of their families continue to endure. I believe the cuts announced by the Department of State in March are short-sighted and counterproductive. Implementing these cuts would do great harm in these countries while undermining our economic and security interests. That said, I do believe that we need to always be looking for ways to improve our foreign assistance program. I have long felt that we need to maximize the proportion of our funding that actually reaches the people of these countries. My amendment will ask the Secretary of State to report how much of our assistance is spent in country versus outside the target countries. It would also urge the Secretary of State to prioritize programs and activities that will be implemented within the target countries rather than externally by foreign organizations. It is crucial that our assistance builds local capacity and strengthens local institutions. I believe this amendment will help to ensure that the citizens and local leaders in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador are the true leaders in the country's development, and I urge my members to support it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. H.Res. Mr. Chaput, did you want to?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to discuss just three of the measures here, and I'll try to do it briefly. First, as co-chair of the Freedom of the Press Caucus with Congressman Adam Schiff, I would urge my colleagues to support H.Res. 345, which we introduced for World Press Freedom Day earlier this month to call attention to the troubling state of press freedom around the world. Access to accurate journalism that holds governments accountable is the indispensable tool that allows citizens to exercise oversight over their government. Whether we think of China or Russia or one of the other smaller dictatorships, or even a few of our allies and partners throughout the world, freedom of the press is too frequently under threat, and in many places simply non-existent. Unless the United States fights to protect press freedom, authoritarians around the world will stifle it, as China is doing right now in exporting its tools for internet censorship, for example. Our founding fathers were right to provide us with strong protections for the press in the First Amendment, and I'm glad to live in America where we still have a press to keep us honest, even though they are capable of sometimes reporting on occasion what some would call fake news. Unfortunately, access to free and independent journalism seems to be associated with pretty much most of the other problems we face in this committee, whether it's authoritarian dictators seeking to retain their grip on power, or disinformation, or corruption, or simply bringing a light to the many human rights abuses of bad actors. So I think it's an issue that we need to keep our eye on, and I want to thank Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall for considering this resolution. Second, I'd like to comment briefly on H.Res. 372, which expresses concern for the U.S.-Turkey alliance. As co-chair of the Turkey caucus, along with my good friend Joe Wilson, as well as my friends on the other side of the aisle, Jerry Connolly and Steve Cohen, I really hoped that this would not come to this. When we take a step back from several sticking points between us and look at the relationship as a whole, it's easy to see why our alliance with Turkey furthers our numerous interests in that part of the world. Unfortunately, Turkey's impending purchase of the S-400 anti-aircraft system from Russia is very damaging for the relationship, and I hope they understand our position in this matter and why we think that this weapons sale is so totally unacceptable. I hope that President Erdogan ultimately makes the right choice, and that the Trump administration works with Turkey to get them Patriot missiles to provide for their air defense needs. And finally, I want to thank Mr. Connolly and Mr. Kinzinger for their work on the Georgia Support Act. As a co-sponsor of this important legislation, I just want to say that Georgia is an important and valued partner that shares our values and is eager to cooperate with the U.S. and the West. Russia poses a serious challenge to all of us, but especially Georgia, not to mention that Vladimir Putin still illegally occupies Abkhazia and South Ossetia. This legislation will go a long way toward helping Georgia with some of these challenges, and I'd urge my colleagues to support this and the other two pieces of legislation that I mentioned, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chaput. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and Mr. McCall for bringing this package of 9 bills to the committee for its consideration and for handling it in the bipartisan comity we are so used to. I thank you. In particular, I want to thank both of you for including H.R. 598, the Georgia Support Act, which I introduced with my Republican counterpart on the Georgia caucus, Mr. Adam Kinzinger. This bill asserts the United States' continued support for the independence and sovereignty of Georgia. It supports Georgia's continued democratic development, including free and fair elections, and reaffirms U.S. opposition to Russian aggression in the region. In Georgia's occupied regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, Russia has fomented unrest, aided separatist movements, and committed serious human rights abuses, including ongoing detentions and killings. Russian forces continue to harass civilian communities all along the administrative boundary line and impede the right of return of internally displaced persons within their own country. H.R. 598 bolsters Georgia's territorial integrity by authorizing sanctions against those responsible for or complicit in human rights violations in those occupied parts of Georgia. As the chairman of the U.S. delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, I'm pleased that the Georgia Support Act also recognizes that Georgia has been a long-standing NATO aspirant country. I've traveled to Georgia 3 times in as many years, including for the spring meeting of NATO's Parliamentary Assembly, and believe Georgia is a key partner for NATO security, and Georgia has had troops in Afghanistan side by side with those of our own. Georgia's Support Act builds on previous efforts that Congress has undertaken to support Georgia's territorial integrity. In the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, we, Congress, enshrined a non-recognition policy for Russia's illegal occupation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia. In the 114th Congress, the House passed H.Res. 660, which Judge Poe and I introduced to express support for Georgia's territorial integrity. That resolution was a clear and unequivocal statement in support of the sovereign territory of Georgia and reiterated the longstanding policy of the United States government not to recognize territorial changes effected by force as dictated by the Stimson Doctrine established in 1932. The Georgia Support Act is a timely expression of congressional support for the vital U.S.-Georgia partnership, which is a strategically important relationship in a critical part of the world. As we approach Georgia's Independence Day next week, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, which reasserts U.S. support for Georgia's sovereignty and clear and forceful opposition to the illegal Russian invasion of Georgian territory and occupation of same. As the House of Representatives recently passed the Crimean Annexation Non-Recognition Act, which my friend Mr. Shabbat and I have introduced in every Congress since the illegal annexation of Crimea, the Georgia Support Act is another clear and unequivocal statement by this Congress on the issue of territorial sovereignty, especially in the eastern part of Europe. With that, I yield back and thank the Chair again.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Engel and Republican Leader McCall, for bringing these crucial bills to a mark. Each one of the bills is a testament to this committee's long tradition of tackling some of the world's thorniest issues and challenges with bipartisan cooperation. I urge my colleagues to support all the measures before us today. I will speak on 3 of them in the time that I have. First, I'd like to speak in support of H.R. 598, the Georgia Support Act, introduced by the co-chairs of the Georgia caucus, Mr. Connolly from Virginia and Mr. Kinzinger from Illinois. While Georgia successfully achieved independence in 1991, Moscow is still, to this day, attempting to bully this small nation. In 2008, Russian troops invaded the country, seizing nearly 1/3 of Georgia's territory, which they still occupy today. The Georgia Support Act is to help our friends in Georgia repel ongoing Russian aggression by bolstering their defenses as well as their cybersecurity and capabilities to combat Russian disinformation campaigns. Importantly, this bill sanctions Russian perpetrators of human rights violations in the occupied regions of Georgia. This is a comprehensive bill that will send a direct message to the Kremlin. We will always stand side by side with Georgia in defense of its territorial integrity and God-given rights and freedoms. Unfortunately, Vladimir Putin would like to see all of the liberated former Soviet states return to Moscow's orbit. He attempts to exert his control over these nations through energy blackmail. That's why I strongly support my colleagues to support H.R. 2023, Protect European Energy Security Act, introduced by Mr. Heck of Washington. This bill makes it clear that Congress opposes Nord Stream 2 pipeline and other energy schemes of Russia and Northern Europe that seek to make our European allies further beholden to Moscow's energy resources. As co-chair of the European Union Caucus, along with my colleague, Mr. Meeks of New York, I believe there is no greater challenge to European security today than energy security and Russia's ongoing blackmail. I'd also like to express my support for House Resolution 129, which highlights Saudi Arabia's troubling detention and persecution of women's rights activists and urging Riyadh to immediately and unconditionally release these advocates and other political prisoners. Just last week, we marked the one-year anniversary of Aziza al-Yusuf's detention by Saudi authorities. Aziza is a mother of 5, grandmother of 8, and a legal U.S. permanent resident. She was arrested, tortured, and is facing trial for advocating for basic human rights. These kinds of arrests fly in the face of Saudi Arabia's stated social reform goals as part of Vision 2030. Persecution of human rights defenders anywhere is reprehensible, and I thank Representative Frankel for her leadership on this issue. Lastly, and as co-chair of the Turkey Caucus, I am increasingly concerned about our relationship with Ankara. Turkey is an appreciated, strategically important NATO ally. Its decision to buy the Russian S-400 missile system is troubling and, in my opinion, indicative of the current government's disdain for our shared values and Turkey's democratic foundations. The fact that they are now thinking of collaborating with Russians on an S-500 system just confirms this to me and others. I will continue to advocate for improved ties between Washington and Ankara, but the S-400 purchase is not only unhelpful to this end, but damaging and dangerous. I call on the Turkish government to cancel this purchase and recommit to its mutually beneficial role in the NATO alliance. I urge my colleagues to support House Resolution 372. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. McCall, for introducing H.R. 2615. The amendment I offer today is designed to enhance our engagement with human rights in the Northern Triangle. It does 3 simple things. First, it expands the list of human rights abuses in the reporting required to include torture, forced disappearance, and arbitrary detentions, particularly in Honduras and Guatemala. These are driving forces of migration and betrayal of universal human rights, and we must be clear about stopping them. Secondly, my amendment adds to the reporting requirements descriptions of measures taken by the Northern Triangle governments to guarantee the rights of indigenous and rural communities. Indigenous people in Guatemala and Honduras are particularly vulnerable to those governments, and we should insist that the governments of those countries are abiding by their international obligations, including the ILO 169. This means free, prior, and informed consent from communities before mega projects are built in their territories. This includes the Grifuna, the Lenca, the Mayas, and the Campesino communities I met in Bohihuelas, in Les Esperanza and Tela. It means actual protection for indigenous and rural land and water defenders, and not the impunity we see in both of these countries. Finally, my amendment adjusts the language of human rights conditionality in the bill to reflect what the appropriation included in this bill. Strengthening the language on conditionality from effective steps in the Alliance of Prosperity to meeting the following conditions. Is a way to guarantee that our human rights conditions will have the teeth they need to be able to genuinely be persuasive to the Northern Triangle governments. I was in Honduras for the 2017 elections and followed closely both the credible accusations of fraud and the widespread human rights abuses that followed. Like so many Americans, I was deeply disappointed to see the State Department certify that effective steps were being taken to improve human rights in Honduras. At the same moment, protesters were being gunned down in the streets. This amendment will ensure that that certification will be based on the actual enjoyment of human rights by El Salvadorians, Guatemalans, and Honduran people, and not allow the government of Juan Orlando Hernandez and Jimmy Morales to game the system and continue in impunity. I also want to add that this committee needs to take a closer look at the role state violence is playing in the exodus from Guatemala, and especially in Honduras. I'm very pleased that this bill takes that seriously, and I'm happy to support it. I also think we need to go one step farther, and as an original co-sponsor of H.R. 1945, the Berta Carters Human Rights in Honduras Act, I would strongly encourage this committee to bring that bill up for markup. Once again, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member for your leadership in this crucial issue, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Omar. Mrs. Wagner.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank you and Ranking Member McCall for working with me on H.R. 2140, the Preventing Child Marriage in Displaced Populations Act, and my amendment to combat violence against women and children in Central America. Last week, in our capacities as co-chairs of the Central America Caucus, Representative Norma Torres and I introduced H.R. 2836, the bipartisan Central American Women and Children Protection Act. My amendment incorporates this legislation into today's Central America Engagement Bill. Central America sadly ranks high among regions of the world for femicide. El Salvador and Honduras are among the top 3 countries in the world with the highest child homicide rates. Northern Triangle governments allow impunity for perpetrators of violence with less than 10% of reported cases resulting in conviction. In April, I visited Guatemala and met women and young girls who told me their deeply personal stories of sexual and domestic violence. These women are driven and they yearn for opportunities to build a better life at home so they can safely grow a family and improve their communities. The mothers that we met with within the country's impoverished western highlands wanted to keep their families together at home. A 1,500-mile journey to our border with limited food and water is particularly dangerous for women and girls who are at severe risk of violence. These women did not view migration as a solution, and they are banding together to root out poverty and fix failing justice systems so their families have economic opportunities. Eliminating the root causes of the migration crisis at our border entails standing with these women. My amendment today would authorize the President to enter into bilateral compacts with the governments of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to strengthen the justice systems of those countries and to create safer communities for women and children. Today, I am also urging my colleagues to support H.R. 2140, the Preventing Child Marriage in Displaced Populations Act. Humanitarian crises put women and girls at a much higher risk of violence and exploitation, including child marriage. 9 of the 10 countries with the highest rates of child marriage are fragile states, where weak institutions, high rates of violence, and stagnant economies make families more likely to resort to child marriage to keep their daughters safe and provide for their futures. Important research conducted by UNICEF revealed that in 2018, more than 700 million women and girls worldwide were married before their 18th birthday, and of these, 250 million were married before their 15th birthday. These women are more likely to experience domestic violence and have worse educational, economic, and health prospects than their unmarried peers. But even though rates of child marriage are on the rise in UN-administered refugee camps, the UN has yet to adopt a formal definition of child marriage or a comprehensive strategy to address the problem in these settlements. This important piece of legislation would direct the United States to lead UN efforts to adopt a definition of child marriage and craft a comprehensive strategy to address child marriages in unadministered refugee settlements. This strategy would include protocols to prevent and monitor child marriages, programs to provide physical, mental, and emotional support for victims, programs offering alternatives for child marriage, and measures to ensure that adults participating in illegal child marriages are held accountable. Child marriage is a violation of human rights and a form of violence against women, and I urge my colleagues to support the Preventing Child Marriage and Displaced Populations Act, and I yield back.
Thank you. Is any other members like some time? Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The barriers that girls and women face do not exist in a vacuum. A woman's right to education, to her bodily autonomy, to self-determination, they're all connected. And we must work with our allies and global organizations to help women and girls achieve true and lasting change. Initiatives like the UN Joint Program to End Child Marriage, which the UNFPA and UNICEF lead jointly, are looking at this issue holistically. They're working to make the social protection, health, education, social and behavioral changes needed to build a truly equitable world for women. And in spite of these important efforts, the United States is not currently contributing funds to the joint program. I am grateful to my colleague from Missouri for introducing the Preventing Child Marriage Act, and I urge the other members of this committee to support this very important legislation that will bolster and affirm the good work of the United Nations to end child marriage. I want to note the important leadership role under UNFPA in this effort. Although the legislation does not mention them by name, they are driving important change through initiatives like the joint program. Finally, Mr. Chairman, access to quality education is one of the strongest tools that we have for combating the epidemic of childhood marriage. And that is why, in addition to supporting Ms. Wagner's bill, I'm also an original co-sponsor of the Keeping Girls in School Act, a bipartisan act introduced by Representatives Frankel and Brooks, legislation that would empower girls by increasing their educational and economic opportunities and security. Girls and women deserve to be educated, to be economically independent, to be the deciders of their own fates. And that is what we believe in the United States and what we need to fight for in all corners of the world. Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall, I hope that the committee will take further steps in the effort to end child marriage and to promote gender equality by marking up the Keeping Girls in School Act as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Houlihan. Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Leader McCall for agreeing to include my bill, H.R. 2046, the Energy Diplomacy Act, in today's markup. I'd also like to thank the lead Republican and Representative Gonzalez, fellow Texans, and the bill's original co-sponsors for their support. Since 1977, when Congress formally gave the Secretary of State primary authority over energy-related foreign policy, there have been significant changes in the global energy landscape. The United States is now the world's top producer of petroleum and natural gas. We've also seen increased weaponization of energy by Russia against our EU and NATO allies, transforming energy into a critical national security issue. This new challenge requires reaffirmed dedication and focus. The Energy Diplomacy Act does just that by authorizing an Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources and defining our energy security and diplomatic priorities. My bill will ensure the State Department has adequate personnel to carry out its mandate and protect and advance the energy security interests of the United States, as well as those of our allies abroad. Finally, this bill advances U.S. energy exports by instructing our diplomats to work in tandem with U.S. energy companies operating abroad. Combating Russia's malign influence in Europe has been at the forefront of the committee's agenda this year, and I firmly believe pushing back on their energy dominance in Europe must be part of our strategy. Thank you again, Chairman and Ranking Member, for including my bill today. I urge my colleagues to support this bill as part of the en bloc and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Allred? No? Okay, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the bipartisan and collegiality that this committee's been run with that has led to not only excellent bills, but bills that I think have unanimous support. As to the Northern Triangle bill, it is ripping our country apart to deal with the refugees from Central America. There is no better investment we can make in American unity than to allow people in the Northern Triangle countries to live where they want to live, which is their own country, in peace, security, and prosperity. As to the USAID branding bill, it is so important that we not only aid countries, but that we make sure they know this is a gift from the American people. We've often called this the flag on the bag requirement or objective when we send bags of food. As to the Georgia Support Act, strongly support it, and I'm pleased that the USAID has assured me that a appropriate amount of aid will go to the Samtskhe-Javahete region in southern Georgia. As to preventing child marriage, very important bill. Particularly, I've focused on the Sindh area of Pakistan, where we see non-Muslim girls kidnapped, converted, and then forced into child marriage. This bill is one small step to deal with that. As to condemning Saudi Arabia, we not only have to condemn Saudi Arabia, but I have legislation that I hope will be marked up in this committee to act to prevent Saudi Arabia from developing a nuclear weapon. And of course, we're all concerned about Turkey. If they are cooperating with Russia with regard to an S-400 and even worse, the development of an S-500 rocket that is inconsistent with their membership in NATO, I yield back.
Thank you. Are there any other members that wish to speak? Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in support of House Resolution 129, condemning the government of Saudi Arabia's continued detention and alleged abuse of women's rights activists. Saudi Arabia has been an important strategic partner of the United States, and we share broad interests, including the defeat of ISIL in Iraq and Syria. But as much as our interests align, those interests are diluted by a divergence concerning women's rights. I wanted to give Saudi leadership the benefit of the doubt when we were told that there would be great social reform, especially with respect to women's rights. I wanted to give Saudi Arabia the benefit of the doubt when women finally got the right to drive. But the disparate impact of Saudi Arabia's male guardianship system, which requires women to obtain permission of their male guardians in health care, employment, and travel decisions, is still felt to this day. The imprisonment of women's rights advocates and the unwarranted psychological and physical abuse is even more upsetting. It has become clear that Saudi leadership largely seeks to maintain the status quo. That is unacceptable. We cannot just hold our adversaries accountable for humanitarian abuses. We must also demand accountability of our strategic partners. This resolution is an important reaffirmation that human rights and democracy are bedrocks of United States foreign policy, and that it necessarily requires advancing the rights and empowerment of women and girls. For as long as I have the privilege of serving in Congress, I will continue to reaffirm those bedrock principles. I urge a yes vote on this resolution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall, and all my colleagues for this very important slate of bills and resolutions. I wish the news media would be as interested in this kind of work instead of focused on the distractions and divisions in this country. And I just wanted to do a special shout out to Ranking Member McCall for H.R. 2744, probably the smallest bill in this package, but an important one because despite our imperfections, the United States of America does a lot of good around the world. And I like the fact that now USAID can express that to the beneficiaries and to people in the world who are not as familiar with our good work as I wish they were, and prospectively hope they will be. So my salutations and gratitude, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Berra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in support of Ms. Wagner's bill, H.R. 2140, which advances the fight against child marriage at the United Nations. But I do remain disappointed that the U.S. currently doesn't contribute to the UN's joint program to end child marriage, especially due to the bipartisan support reflected by this measure. This bill highlights the great work of the UN, in particular UNICEF and UNHCR, but I would also note that UNFPA is working alongside UNICEF and UNHCR in refugee settings to prevent child marriage. UNFPA is meeting the unique health needs, legal and psychological needs of child brides and young mothers. I had the chance to see firsthand when I visited the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, where you have tens of thousands of Syrian refugees. You see UNFPA working alongside UNICEF, running a comprehensive women's health center that started with U.S. funding. They've delivered more than 10,000 babies without a single maternal death, an incredible achievement by any measure. Zatari is home to tens of thousands of Syrian refugees. Syria is an enduring problem that the United States is still grappling with, as our full committee hearing showed this morning. The UNFPA study referenced in today's bill showed that child marriage among displaced Syrians is 4 times higher than what it was before the crisis broke out in 2011. So this health center also delivers counseling, legal referrals, and psychological care to the girls who were in child and forced marriages. Child marriage often marks the end of a girl's education and the beginning of their life as a mom before she's physically or mentally ready. I was also glad to see the UN's focus on child marriage prevention. In Zatari, the UN supports schooling, but also programs for young people in art, sports, cooking, computer skills, and language. So I'm happy to see support for the UN joint program on child marriage mentioned in this bill. It's important that the U.S. support the UN and their NGO partners working on these issues. And I want to emphasize that we shouldn't be pulling funding from the very agencies serving women and girls, namely UNFPA. We should stand proudly with all our UN partners who do this work every day. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Are there any other members seeking recognition? Okay, hearing no further requests for recognition, then, without objection, the committee will proceed to consider the noticed items en bloc. Without objection, each measure is considered as read, and without objection, the amendments to each are considered as read and are agreed to. Without objection, the question occurs on the measures en bloc as amended. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The measures considered en bloc are agreed to, and without objection, each measure in the en bloc is ordered favorably reported as amended, and each amendment to each bill shall be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. I want to thank you very much. This concludes our business today. I want to especially thank Ranking Member McCall and all of the committee members for their contributions and assistance with today's markup. The committee stands adjourned.